Um, Welcome to Lecture 5. Again, I'm Dr. Bilge Azgın, and I will be delivering the Lecture 5 to you. Now, as you remember in the Lecture 4, we talk about a lot of things in Chapter 4 and Lecture 4 and 3. We talk about the French Revolution, American Revolution. We talk about Hobbes, Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Um, how the how the idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity came about, how the human rights came about, how the inalienable rights in French Revolution or American Revolution came about theoretically. We all kind of touch upon that space, and I finished the lecture 4 by saying that, well, let's look at the ancient ones as well, since we are kind of uh, scanning the area of of the political uh, science, an introduction to political science. And here we have the guy called Plato. Now, Plato, that's where the political theory starts actually for the Western world. It starts with, I mentioned to you about Athens as a polis, as a city state back in 500 BC, 400 BC. And Plato is one of the most prominent political theorists of the era. And he's a student of Socrates. He has been a quite influential figure in the Western philosophy. So that's why we need to a little bit give you an introduction for that. And Socrates was a kind of a very legendary guy. He was a student of Socrates, and Socrates was a guy who wandered around and asked good questions to people in when he visited the marketplace, when he visited everything. He always talked about the nature of what is virtue, what is good, how what is happiness in life, how do we get happy, um, can it be learned, can it not be learned, all these debates. And he was very critical thinker as well, Socrates. He's a very a mythical figure. He never wrote anything, but Plato, his student, wrote about Socrates. In Plato has wrote a lot of dialogues, and but Socrates ended up in a really bad situation because he was accused for corrupting the youth and inventing new gods back in the Athens, and then he was put to trial, and the jury voted for the majority of the jury voted for his death, and he died accordingly. So we have Plato here. Plato is the one who is kind of a very foundational, as I said, and he established a school called Academy. What we today learn or speak about as academy comes from again ancient Greece, Plato, Academy, where he taught philosophy and mathematics and other sciences. These philosophers back then, they had the thirst for knowledge in every area, not only in philosophy, but in many other things. And that's good to know. At the entrance of the academy, no one shall enter unless he knows geometry. That's what was written in Plato's Academy. And Plato, here you can read, he despised the sophist. The sophists were a school of thought back then who thought that everything was relative and that there was no absolute knowledge, there was no truth, and that the truth could be manipulated and shaped by the arguments. So, for instance, for sophists, man is the measure of all thing. Man is the measure of all thing, meaning that the man is the measure of all thing in that sense that it's everything is relative and the man has a different opinion and the truth cannot be found. Well, Plato was really against this idea, and he tried to construct a new philosophical system that would kind of win out the argument that the sophists put forward. So Plato had an idea of course, just like for many things, he had the idea of what kind of and what is an ideal state, like how human beings should be ruled, or what kind of a state is the perfect one. All right. So the mother of philosophy is curiosity, and its essence is the research of truth. As I told you, this Plato guy, he was very interested in finding the truth, the absolute truth that is not changing according to circumstance, the position and the individual, the person that is trying to claim it, but he was searching for the truth, unchangeable, constant, and it's the truth all the time. And he come with this two different kind of things that he called it the ideas, which are the ideal conceptual essences of things, cannot change but serve as basis for every actual and possible change. Now, what I know that it can be a little bit confusing, but it's okay. What Plato argued basically, that there are two worlds. The world that we see around us with five senses, that's the world we live in. But Plato thought and argued that there is also another world beyond the five senses, and that is the world of the ideas, which are unchanging and it's kind of eternal. So, for instance, for Plato, you can see many good things around the world, in particulars. But for Plato, that is only a reflection of the pure good which exists in the world, in the realm of ideas, which you can only reach through an intellect. That is, you cannot reach it by your five senses, by smell, by looking at it, by tasting it, all the five senses that we gather the data. Now, Plato is claiming that with reason, with rationality in the mind's eye, the philosopher can reach to that pure world of ideas. So we have quite a dichotomous view of the world presented to us by Plato. Plato is saying that what you see around you, the chairs, the table, this laptop, this mouse, all these things, they are really the reflection, the shadows of the ideas of that pure world that you can access only through reason. And in this world, things are temporary. All right, it's temporary, it's changing, it's decaying, it's deforming. Whereas in the world of ideas, all these essences, they are unchanging and they are eternal and they are permanent and they are in its purest forms. So, for instance, in this case, Plato argued that for an ideal state to exist, a philosopher should reach to the world of ideas that we are mentioning it here, the ideas, should reach to the ideas through their reason and get the purest form of good, the concept of good in eternal one and pure format, the good, the just, and then try to implement it on the earth that we live in the five world senses. So Plato wrote about on justice and his ideal state on a dialogue, a book called The Republic. And The Republic is the book that Plato lay out his ideas about how state should run. As I told you, we have now different, everyone votes, everyone is equal. We have all these human rights discourse that defines our world. Whereas you need to know that the ideas about how things should be, what is the ideal way of organizing a society and governing a society, have started a long time ago. And that's why we are looking at Plato, so that you kind of widen your perception and your knowledge of these things. You know, we talk about Hobbes, we talk about Locke, how we talk about for Locke that there are three principles: life, liberty, and property, and that any government who violates that, people have the right to rebel against that government, to restore the three inalienable rights which man owned in the state of nature. If you look at the lecture 4 in the video, you're going to see me talking about these things a lot. But now, look, we are talking about Plato and his idea of a perfect state, of an ideal state. And for him, the ideal state should be divided into three types of caste system, as if, or a segments. Here, because Plato believed that human soul has three elements, three segments. The top, the highest part of the human soul is the intellect, the reason, whereas the second segment, the lower one, is like the spirited heart, the virtuous part, and the third category, third segment, the lowest one, is the appetite and the desire part. So Plato thought that just like soul has three parts, every human soul has three parts, that's what he thought, society that human beings live in should also reflect that three-type soul. So if the lowest part of the human soul is appetite, and then it should correspond to the agricultural workers and handicraftsmen, the lowest people. At the second, the top one, upper part of the pleasure and then the handicraftsmen and agriculture, I told you that we had a virtue, spirited, courage kind of. At the second level was that kind of courageous spirits. So, and that should reflect the guardians, that is, who guards the state, the warriors. And at the top, imagine this as a pyramid, huh? At the highest level, because human soul, the highest level of the three parts of human soul is reason, it should be correspond to the philosophers. Because philosophers, according to Plato, of course, are the only ones who can use the purest form of their own intellect, and since they are able to use their intellect, and since the intellect is the toppest part of the soul, philosophers should rule the state, should rule the society. So we have three very rigid hierarchical groups presented by Plato for us for his ideal state. At the lowest level is what we say agricultural workers or handicraftsmen or peasants. At one above that is we have guardians, auxiliary. Guardians are those who guard the state, the warriors. And at the highest level, the ruling elite level, at the top of the pyramid, we should have philosophers. And that's why Plato comes with this idea in his Republic that as long as philosophers should be kings and kings should be philosophers, there is no hope for this ideal state. Now that's a big statement, and I will repeat it so that you get it. As long as philosophers become kings and kings becomes philosophers, there is no hope for the ideal state. So according to Plato, philosophers should be kings. They should be the one who rules the countries. That's why, that's how an ideal state, good state, and just state can be formed. That's a very, of course, kind of a elitist idea if you look from 21st century. And notice how when I talk about the French Revolution, I talk about with the estate system. Remember how the estate system was in Europe? India, they had the caste system. In Europe, in feudal Europe, they had the estate system where you had all the commons at the lowest, and at the hierarchy level we have the church, the priest, and one above at the top we had the aristocrats who were privileged, and who owned the, who also guarded the, who also abused, provided the army force to the countries back then, to the kingdoms back then. And then that's what French Revolution broke apart. How commons came out and said that enough with the privileges of church or the priest or the aristocrats. Everyone is equal before the law. You don't get to be privileged because you're born as an aristocrat. You should be judged with your merits, not with your birth. So what we call that a meritocracy, that is, you get rewarded and get your status from the merits that you achieve in life, not from the birth like aristocrat. And that's what French Revolution did, as I explained to you, with the ideals of fraternity, equality, and liberty for every citizen. Well, now we're talking about Plato, 400, 500 BC now here, and he, of course, has a very kind of, again, rigid hierarchic and very kind of elitist way of designing a society, where the philosophers who knows the most and the best should rule both the auxiliary and the common man. But again, for Plato, this is necessary. This is highly necessary, simply because the philosophers have the only access to the ideal world. You remember what we talk about? I told you about the ideas, the world of ideas, where the concept of pure justice and pure good exists, and that world, which is more real than the world that you see around you, which is purer than the world you see around you, because the world you see around you is mere shadows, according to Plato. That pure world can only be accessed with reason, through reason. And who has the reason? The philosophers. So that means philosophers can only access to that absolutely pure forms, or in the idea, in the world of ideas, and they can then bring the reflection of that good world, of that good ideas, to this world. That's why Plato insists that philosophers should be kings, or kings then should be philosophers, if not. Okay? Because they have an access to the world of ideas, and the society should be ruled with the ideas world. Now, Aristotle is a student of Plato, but he had a very different ideas than Plato. All right, Aristotle is also very famous philosopher. These Plato and Aristotle are the two foundational philosophers of Western world. That's why we are kind of going through them. Aristotle also was tutored Alexander the Great in Macedonia back then. He also formed a school like Plato did. Plato's school was academy. Aristotle's school was what we call lyceum. Lycée, high school, we call it in French. So it comes from lyceum, lycée, comes from Aristotle, back again in Athens. What is interesting about Aristotle, then, he is the founding father of variety of sciences, such as logics, syllogism, biological classification, rhetoric, political theory, grammatics, literary theory, etc., etc. This guy, Aristotle, wrote a book about ethics. I told you in the first class, he wrote a book about politics. And I explained to you, when I was explaining to you, we started with, the first lecture started with explaining to you the meaning of politics. And I told you that it means the affairs of polis. Well, guess what? It comes from Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote a book about politics. He wrote a book on ethics. He wrote a book on rhetorics. He wrote a book on wide variety of issues. He wrote a book also on metaphysics. So he was also very distinguished thinker of the Western world. Well, Aristotle has a quite different idea of the ideal systems. All right, look at how he says here a biological classification. Aristotle liked to research and classify things. And he did that in his book Politics, when he was trying to find out what is the best political system on earth. All right? He looked around himself, he visited many countries, and he came with an idea of how the ideal state should be. And for him, the ideal state is, he first classified the states, as you can see. He classified six different regimes: monarchy, aristocracy, politeia, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. You can see them at the all the way bottom. You know, for him, the good types of political formations, he says, are monarchy, aristocracy, and politeia. Where are bad types, he says, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Well, so he classifies us six regimes. It's very different than Plato, as you can see. Monarchy, and how does he classify these regimes? That's one of the things that I want to go over. He looks at two things, basically. How many men is running it, these regimes, and are they running it for their own selfish interest or for the common good? So that's the criteria for Plato distinguish his six regimes, classifying six regimes. Well, he looks at how they are ruled, by how many they are ruled, all right, and how they are ruled. Are they ruled for the selfish interest of the ruler or for the common good? And these two criteria determines the formations, okay? So if you look at monarchy, monarchy is ruled by one person, because as I told you, the first criteria is by how many people are it's ruled. Monarchy is ruled by one person. Aristocracy is run by few, and politeia is run by many. Well, look at the bad types. Tyranny is also run by one man. Oligarchy is run by few, and democracy is run by many. But notice the difference. Both monarchy and tyranny is run by only one single individual. But monarchy is a good type of political regime, according to Aristotle, whereas tyranny is a bad one. Why? Because according to Aristotle, monarchy is run by one man, by one king, but the king is running. The second criteria is how they are running. The king is running for the common good, not for its own selfish interest. Well, in tyranny, it's run by one king as well, but it's running for its own selfish interest, not for the common good. So do you see how we have, Aristotle have this dichotomy of things? Same with aristocracy. Aristocracy means a country run by, a political system run by the few. Oligarchy is also a system run by the few. But what is different? What makes different aristocracy from oligarchy is that aristocracy, the few is running, but the few is running for the common good, not for the common for the selfish interest. Whereas in oligarchy, the few man is running for its own selfish interest. Now, the third and the last thing that you might be amazed, the politeia, the third political regime, good what Aristotle considers as good, is ruled by many, but it's run for the common good. Whereas for Aristotle, democracy is not a good political system, it's a bad thing because it's run by many, but then it's many is running for its own particular selfish interest. So that's why, so that's how Aristotle forms his own classification. It's very different than Plato. Plato is looking for, the world of ideas, that the kings should be philosophers or philosophers should be kings so that they can access to the world of ideas and they can bring the just and good to and implement it on this earth. This Aristotle, no interest about the ideas. He's looking around himself, observing empirically, and he's saying, okay, this is the 6 type of regimes that I could observe, and okay, I'm going to classify them with these 2 criteria. And for me, politeia is a good system, whereas a democracy is bad because democracy is a mob rule. It's ruled by many, but then it's ruled by for its own selfish interest, whereas politeia is the best regime available, Aristotle argued. From all the good ones, monarch, aristocracy, politeia, Aristotle argued that politeia was the best political regime, as it allowed the middle class, many people to attend and to participate in politics, and then participate in a way that brings the common good, not the selfish interest that tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy brings. And that would be the end of our chapter, lecture 5. I will see you in the next lecture. Thanks for listening, and take care. Bye.